program. Total credits is 80. An exam would be annual for the first 2 semesters, and then the learners can give the exam semester wise. There are 13 core theory courses which are compulsory worth 48 credits. 5 are core and compulsory lab courses worth 20 credits. The project or dissertation is of 8 credits, and 1 credit is equal to 30 hours of self-study in ODL system. There are 3 elective courses. The learners can choose any one course from 3 elective courses. Each course is of 4 credits. Spread, it can help in teaching and research, cartography, mapping, urban and regional planning, population and demographic studies, natural resource management, environmental management and sustainability, geospatial analysis, GIS and remote sensing, tourism and recreational industries, administration and marketing, disaster management, transportation and logistic industries. So what are you waiting for? Alternatively, you can type in Google IGNOU admissions and you will be redirected to the Samarth portal of IGNOU and go and register there and take admissions as soon as possible. In case of any query, you can write to us at satyaraj@ignou.ac.in. Happy learning!
Hello, good afternoon all of you. I wish a very happy new year to all the viewers and learners of School of Translation Studies and Training. I hope you would enjoy the way I would like to interact with you on a very new idea and a theme on cultural translation. As we know, this is a new phenomenon in the area of translation studies. We know translation as a discipline, as an act, as a product, but we do lesser know about the act of translation and about. Please try to understand the way I would like to interact with you on the theme cultural translation, because translation is more or less known as linguistic exercise, but today I would like to let you come into a new domain of knowledge. What do we mean? We mean the act of translation to be undertaken in a perspective of culture. The operational unit has to be taken is neither it is confined to the transfer of meaning, nor it is confined to the transfer of message, but also it is confined to the sense and to the perspective, to the nuances and of course an environment the text has been incorporated into. What do we do while proceeding to the act of translation? We do understand what is the perspective of translation, what is the outcome of the translation and to whom it is to be addressed. If we do not restrict the problem of understanding the act of translation and the very motive of translation, we do not do justice to the act of translation. What I mean to convey the message hereby is that we have to take into account what is the target audience. What do we mean by target audience? Target audience means the readers or the viewers who are going to read it, who are the text which is to be translated, for whom, and what benefit they are going to get from it. So if this is to be taken into account, I think we will be doing justice to the act of translation. Otherwise, it will be a merely exercise of transferring meaning from one language to the other. As we know, culture itself is a interdisciplinary concept. What do we mean by culture? Before considering upon cultural translation, let us focus on culture. Unless otherwise we do know what does it mean by culture, we will not be able to address the specific persona pertaining to the cultural translation. We do mean by culture various norms, perspectives, customs, and of course exercises and practices going through number of years for a section of people or a group of sections of people. For example, we rituals, whether it is pertaining to religious or to it. So if we focus on culture, we do focus the various perspective of sociological, anthropological, and of course philosophy of religion. If we focus on these perspectives, we focus on cultural perspective. So if we focus on cultural translation, and if we do incorporate the interdisciplinary approach, then we do incorporate anthropology, sociology, cultural studies, and of course linguistics perspective of translation studies. Combining all together into one, if we come to a narrative which is relating to transfer of message and perspective of language, that rather than the transfer of words. While processing the act of translation, earlier we would have focused on what was the practice. It was practice that transfer of the equivalent word for the specific word from source language into target language. Rather than, we are now compelled to undertake the task of translation, keeping in view the various nuances pertaining to a particular culture. As we understand, culture is in the culture. For example, if a text is written into text is written into German, German consonances and German perspectives are not transferable into Indian perspective, but to some extent or the other, we would like to transfer the meaning and nuances and of course the senses or norms from one culture to the other. So this is a perspective which has to be taken into account while taking into the consideration the task of cultural translation. This is why when we talk of cultural translation, one has to take into account that it is not a fixed translation. It has to be transferred in a liquid sensibility. This liquid sensibility does not confine into a specific horizon. The horizon transfers, I think if I am trying to make it simpler for the reviewers, I think understanding, I would like to give an example. For example, the technical terms which are easily transferable are the words which are simpler. If they are put into different culture, they are easily not transferable. For example, if we use few words which are commonly used in Indian perspective like khadaun or jani, they are not likely to be transferred into different culture, and they have to be retained. And for that purpose, for example, khadaun was used as wooden sandal by Mahatma Gandhi in a text translated by him, what he wanted to convey the message. But if we focus on how good it was, I would like to say it was not good translation. It was literal translation. It did not convey the text message. Rather, it could not convey the transfer of culture. It was confined to a literal sensibility. while the purpose of translation is to be taken into account the cultural perspective of translation. Like transferring of meaning is easy task, but transferring of culture is very difficult task, and I think no one in translation is expert or competent enough to transfer the whole culture. Whether or not one has to take into consideration some parts are of the text is missing, some parts of the text are missing, some nuances are missing. They cannot be transferred as we know. For example, we can transfer the currency from one pocket to the other. Meaning cannot be transferred from one text or language to the other. The same business has to be taken into account before considering this thing. But now we come to know when the term cultural translation was used first. Let us know that the term cultural translation was used firstly in 1985 by Roser. He used the term with reference to the anthropological studies. As we know, the person whom I named was anthropologist, and he used this term cultural translation firstly in 1985 in his discussion pertaining to the translation with reference to anthropological perspective, and the term was used. Later on, not many more things have happened in discussion pertaining to cultural translation. A couple of books have come since after that, and the first one was brought out in 2009 by Rosen, Cultural Translation Problems and Perspectives. Another book brought out by Maitland, What is Cultural Translation? None other than this any published book have been noticed by me, and of course this is fact that very few research papers have been brought out, and they are just focusing on the cultural aspects of translation, not much more on cultural translation. So I let you know that this is a nuance and this is a niche area pertaining to translation, and that should be taken into account. But before I come to that perspective, I would like to let you know the perspective of this translation pertaining to translation studies. The discipline itself was noticed, and that came into existence in 1970s. Firstly, it was named by André Lefebvre, and of course that was endorsed by other speakers and other authors. So the very idea of translation studies emerged in 1970s, later on, to be more specific, in 1978. Since after that, the translation as an act, as an exercise, and translation as a discipline of studies, they have been bifurcated. Prior to that, translation was used as a part of discipline of studies pertaining to linguistics. Later on, it was a part of comparative study, and of course this was used as an act, as a manual exercise of undertaking the transfer of meaning from one language to the other. It was tried to give a scientific temper by Naida, later on other speakers and other authors, equivalent transfer of meaning. But since after that, many ideas have emerged, and very different perspectives have been taken into account pertaining to translation studies itself. As I would like to mention that earlier the translation was exercised as a linguistic exchange. Later on, what was pertaining to that, the focus of the operational unit. What do we mean by operational unit? In process of translation, there are 3-4 operational units, and now the most difficult problem is that to which of the unit should give a central space. So let us come to the fact, and let us know what are the operational units. The operational units of translation are word. When we say operational units of translation, it means while translating, if one focuses more on word transfer or transfer of meaning, it means this to be more specific in gender. The person has to take into account what is to be transferred. Meaning itself, or the literal meaning, contextual meaning, or the horizontal meaning, or the cultural dimension of that very meaning. If we focus more on transfer of meaning, then we focus on more perspective, and so that very perspective is focused on the operational unit of word. If you focus, like for example, some understand that the meaning lies in the word, but more recently that is an old idea. The meaning doesn't lie in a very particular word. Word meaning changes from one perspective, from one area to the other. For example, I would like to make it easier, rather focusing more theoretical. I would like to focus for Hindi viewers or the Indian viewers. I would like to let you know that a word Anushasan is used in Hindi, and that is used for discipline, that is used for punishment. Both the words are used in English. Like Shiksha is used for English word education in Hindi viewers among the Hindi belts, for example. But that very Shiksha is used for punishment in Marathi or Malayalam languages. So if one has to translate these words into that very language, one has to be very careful about the perspective of that very meaning. So what I would like to underline or referring these words is that the meaning does not lie in the word. It lies in the perspective of usage. How do we use that very word? If it is not used in a specific significance, if it is not used in a particular perspective, the meaning changes its words also. The other idea is that the meaning lies in a complete sentence. Unless otherwise a sentence is read or represented, the meaning would not be transferred. But more or less, this is also an old idea. This is also treated an old idea because we transfer the exact meaning what we understand. What is supposed to be done, text has to be given. The other, unless otherwise a text is given, one is not able to transfer the meaning. So the text has to be taken into account, and in that very perspective, the operational unit of translation is text. But as Andre Lefebvre points out, the operational unit of translation is neither word nor a sentence nor a particular text. Rather than the operational unit of translation is culture. So while considering the cultural translation, this idea was emerged, though there was no book brought out and published by Andre Lefebvre on cultural translation, but he gave an idea pertaining to the cultural perspective of translation. The cultural perspective of translation emerged in 1990, as I pointed out, with reference to Andre Lefebvre in his editorial book, and that was edited by in company with Susan Bassett, and the title suggests that translation, culture and history. With this book, he came with an introduction pertaining to a longish note, and that was titled Proust's Grandmother and 1001 Nights, a Cultural Tone in Translation Studies. With reference to translation studies, the cultural turn in translation studies, the introduction which was authored by Andre Leffer and Susan Bassett, that are very pertinent pertaining to cultural perspective of translation. But I would like to mention that there was no reference made as cultural translation, whereas the term was used by Roser in 1985. Of course, he was anthropologist, and it doesn't mean if one person refers a particular word in a specific meaning or perspective, the author or the competent translatologist would have taken into account. It would have not been under his consideration. Andre Leffer and Susan Bassett, they would have not gone through that, but even then they had their own idea. Later on, there was a book brought out by that was also taken into account, as I mentioned, what is cultural translation, and there was also was a horizon or a background of translation. So it was not the only parameter of focusing on culture, but of course cultural consonances should also be taken into account while we make a task of translation. What is the purpose of translation? The purpose of translation is to introduce a text to the language that has, in which that has been written. For example, if the translation was not would have not been undertaken by Gayatri Spivak, the of grammatology, which was authored by the post-colonial thinker, I think that would have not come to us in a sense that we would have not been introduced with that. That was authored in French, so we would have not come to be acquainted with that knowledge or the perspective in which that was considered. So it is not possible for everyone to be acquainted with all the languages which are spoken in the world, or even the significant languages or the major languages of the world, rather than they are to be acquainted by the means of translation. So translation is used as a means of cultural exchange also. So that should also be taken into account while discussing the very idea of cultural translation. Maitland, which I mentioned, the Maitland, what is cultural translation? He pointed out 5 basic components pertaining to cultural translation. One was, of course, introduction to the given text. If we are going to translate a particular text into a different culture or different perspective, one has to take into account what is the introduction of that very text. If, for example, if I am not able to understand the perspective of translation, the background of that very text, we would not be able to transfer the meaning itself. The second thing is that incorporation. One has to be acquainted with the text and, of course, the perspective, the cultural components, and not the original one, but of course into which the meaning has to be conveyed into. Like, for example, if it is to be translated from Malayalam into Hindi, one has to take into account the very perspective of Kerala, Malayali audience, and of course, very nuances which are pertaining to the viewers or the target audience. For example, Godan was translated, Godan authored by Premchand, that was translated into English. And of course, first translation was titled as Gift of a Cow. But later on it was understood it was to convey. Then it was thought upon that the title must remain the same, because Godan have very cultural perspective pertaining to Indian ethos and moralities, religious moralities, for example, I would like to focus on. So this incorporation has to be taken into account. The cultural significance has to be taken. The translator has to touch upon and of course dissociate himself or herself, because unless otherwise he dissociates from the given text, the subjective he or she would like to focus on the given text, he or she is going to transfer. The fourth one is interaction. Of course, interpretation. Interpretation is a subject matter. It doesn't mean whatever is written that has to be conveyed or transferred. While we translate the text, we should focus what are the political corrections. For example, if a text is to be translated for foreign authors or viewers or readers, one must take into account culture or not. For example, if an Indian text is to be, which is pertaining to political correctness, whether all the facts or features should be conveyed to the foreign viewers or readers or not. One has to take into account the cultural perspective along with the political correctness, political sovereignty, integrity, and of course, one has to take into account the geographical perspective and the territorial perspective also. So one has to interpret along with that, and one has to take into account that what is pertinent. For example, if a text was written 500 years ago, one has to be translated with the perspective that the readers are not get offended with the text they are going to be acquainted. So I think these are 5 more components and they should be taken into account. Cultural translation is a niche area. I think it needs much more attention, and in coming sessions I would like to focus much more on that. With this note, I would like to thank you all for having acquainted with me, having joined, and thank you so much for joining with us. Thanks indeed.